Last week we talked about the protagonist, so naturally this week we're going to talk about contagonists. The antagonist deserves as much or more thought than the protagonist does, because in a lot of ways, a protagonist is only as good as the antagonist that they oppose. The antagonist is what drives the conflict in the story. They play a major role in engaging the reader, and if used correctly, they can make your protagonist either more likable or less likable. You also, at least in my view, get a lot more freedom with your antagonist than you do with your protagonist. As we'll see later in the video, there are a number of different directions that you can take with the antagonist that you can't necessarily take with the protagonist. Now, just like any other character, there are some things you need to keep in mind when writing an antagonist, and a lot of misconceptions that are best avoided. So yeah, we're doing the myth format thing again. I don't really care for this format, but I did it for the protagonist video last week, and I really like symmetry, so here we are. Please don't step on that. Sorry, the cat's destroying stuff behind me. Myth number 1. The antagonist needs to be a bad person, or more specifically, a villain. They're not bad, they're just misunderstood. Just like the cat, who is... Are you done? I mentioned last week that the protagonist doesn't necessarily need to be a hero, but they do need to be likable enough that the reader becomes invested in their outcome. While the standard way to write an antagonist, that was really hard to say, is to make them unlikable, unheroic, and to invest the reader in their downfall, you don't necessarily have to go that route. Your antagonist can be likable, sympathetic, or downright heroic. They aren't the antagonist because they're a bad person. They are the antagonist because they oppose the protagonist. Pairing a sympathetic and heroic protagonist with a non-villainous and potentially as sympathetic antagonist, both with a goal that they can't both achieve, can make the story go to some interesting places. Similarly, a morally gray or anti-hero protagonist against an equally morally gray or perhaps less morally gray antagonist can also be an interesting avenue to explore. These kinds of stories are really interesting because it makes the audience doubt, perhaps, who they should be rooting for. It can build some internal conflict for the protagonist if the antagonist that they're opposing is not a villain or more heroic than they are. And if you feel like it, you can make some commentary about how society defines heroes and villains and how these definitions can change depending on your perspective. All kinds of interesting stuff. That being said, the most common template is still to have the antagonist be a non-sympathetic and unlikable character. But don't be afraid to deviate from that template. Hell, you can deviate from it entirely and not make the antagonist the character at all. Myth number 2. The antagonist needs to be a character. I don't know if it's possible to write a story where the protagonist isn't an actual character. Yes, a non-human protagonist is easy enough to do, but a characterless protagonist, I don't know that I've ever heard of that, let alone know what it would look like. The antagonist, on the other hand, is quite often not a character at all. I talked about this in the conflict video when we covered character versus environment conflict. In those types of stories, the antagonist is not readily personified. If your story involves a volcano or an earthquake or a malevolent piece of technology that's gone berserk, then it involves character versus environment conflict, and the antagonist is generally not another character. And yes, I'm lumping character versus society and character versus technology and whatever else into the broader category of character versus environment, only because it's way faster to say character versus environment than listing all those other things. You see, the antagonist is just the force that opposes the protagonist and drives the conflict. This doesn't require that it be personified into a character. With some variations on character versus environment, such as character versus society, you may occasionally have the opposing force personified in some way. Like if your protagonist is fighting against an oppressive government, they may encounter agents of said government. But generally the force they are opposing is not tied to a specific character, and I would still argue that the antagonist is not any one of those characters. The antagonist also doesn't need to be an external force at all. If the main conflict in the story is character versus self, then the antagonist might be looking back at the protagonist in the mirror. In these situations, the force opposing the protagonist is their own self-doubt, maybe something from their past or some other flaw that they need to overcome. Whatever it is, it's not manifested into an external force, either personified or not, but it's still the antagonist. So far we've seen that you have a lot of flexibility in the antagonist, and that the antagonist plays a very important role in the story. But how important is that role? Myth number 3, the protagonist is more important than the antagonist. This is very much an opinion of mine, but I would argue that an excellent protagonist will fall flat if not paired with an equally excellent antagonist. And that you can get away with a lackluster protagonist so long as your antagonist is up to snuff. What I'm saying here is that the antagonist is what makes the story. One of the main reasons that we get invested in the protagonist is because of the obstacles they need to overcome. And who creates those obstacles? If the antagonist fails to put interesting obstacles or opposition in front of the protagonist, or if they don't seem like they have the potential to defeat the protagonist, then it doesn't matter how interesting or likable the protagonist is. If the protagonist doesn't have something meaningful to overcome, then the audience isn't going to care. One of the major causes of having a weak or cliched antagonist is a lack of motivation and a general lack of characterization. If the only reason the antagonist is causing all of this opposition is so that the plot can happen, then that's a problem. There should be a compelling reason that the antagonist does what they do. Just like any other main character, they should have fully fleshed out motivations and goals. And this doesn't just apply to personified antagonists. If the antagonist is the government of an evil empire, make sure that the backstory is well thought out. If it's something internal to the protagonist, make sure what led to the internal conflict is well developed. Of course, if your non-personified antagonist is something like a tornado or a volcano or a really, really tall mountain, then you need to do less of this, but I think you get the point. The antagonist, if it's a character, needs to be a well-developed character, just like any other main character. If it's a piece of your world building, then it needs to be a well-thought-out and well-exposited piece of your world building. If it is something like a tornado or a volcano or a really tall mountain, make sure that the danger is clear to the reader and that the obstacles the protagonist needs to overcome are significant enough. Doing all of these things will bring your antagonist to the next level and also help your protagonist. Well, it will hinder the protagonist because you're putting more opposition in front of them, but I think you know what I mean, again. Speaking of obstacles, I didn't write a transition to the conclusion. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can watch all my other writing advice related videos. I don't know why I said that so stiltedly. And subscribe to my channel. I post new videos every Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.